Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Ensuring eDiscovery Process Compliance with Microsoft 365. Over the next few minutes, we'll be providing some perspective around what it takes to build an effective eDiscovery process, talking about how that process can work in a Microsoft 365 context, and highlighting some areas where third-party tools fill in some of the gaps that exist. My name is Rick Wilson. I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Solutions at Sherpa Software, and I'm joined today by a special guest, my colleague, Marta Ferensbach. Marta is the Director of Product Services here at Sherpa, and she's worked extensively with our clients on their eDiscovery programs. Just a couple of housekeeping notes as we get started. First, if you have a question about any of the content today, please enter those questions into the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the session. Next, we'll be sending out a recording of today's event. So if you'd like to share it with a colleague or review some of the information we cover, you should be receiving that link in a day or two. Some of you watching today may not be familiar with Sherpa. Our focus is creating software that helps our clients manage electronic information. That includes our topic today, eDiscovery, but also a larger set of information governance capabilities. We've been successfully delivering products that fulfill those mandates for a long time. In fact, last year we celebrated our 20-year anniversary. A lot has changed since we launched Mail Attender, our first product back in 1999, and we're certainly managing more information in more locations than we did 20 years ago. But it's still important to have tools in place to help you locate that information and control it. Sherpa helps clients, both large and small, over a wide range of industries, address their difficult information management challenges. Now let's dive into our topic today. Marta, could we tap into some of your expertise to talk about what a successful eDiscovery process should look like?
Sure. So I think the best way to tackle our topic in general is to start by discussing the basics of eDiscovery and then talk about how Microsoft 365 handles the process within its tools. Then we'll segue into looking at the pitfalls of the process in Microsoft 365. So a good foundation here is essential because the number one way to avoid those pitfalls is to have an effective eDiscovery process. This starts with understanding what eDiscovery is and the impact it can have on everyday business. Technically, electronic discovery is the act of identifying, preserving, collecting, reviewing, and producing electronically stored information, which is also known as ESI, in response to a request for production. These requests can come from a variety of sources, but most critical usually stem from legal proceedings. However, please keep in mind that eDiscovery demands originate from other departments, including compliance, security, or HR, and data requests can even be triggered from outside your organization, particularly if you're subject to something like open records laws or other regulations like HIPAA for healthcare or privacy protection laws like GDPR or CCPA. So eDiscovery is basically a request to produce records under the purview of your business. This data can be stored in a number of locations, some of which are covered by your Microsoft 365 implementation, but it's also hidden in desktops, corporate systems, things like SharePoint or PeopleSoft, social media accounts or legacy applications, and don't forget places like backup tapes, mobile phones, laptops. Now, aside from all of this, email communications are the most requested type of data, but any data can be subject to eDiscovery requests. So knowing where your data resides, or some people might say hides, and knowing how to access it is critical. This is because an organization is responsible, in other words, reliable, for all data stored in its systems or under its purview. Furthermore, in many jurisdictions, including the United States, the responding party in a litigation has the duty to provide this data. In other words, you are legally required to find all reasonably accessible data relevant to the matter at hand. And this duty arises when an organization has an inkling it will become involved in litigation, not just when it's sued or subpoenaed. Lastly, the steps to producing this information must follow very strict rules. Failure to do so can result in severe penalties and end up costing you a considerable amount in money, in time, and stress. This is especially true when you're dealing with legal or regulatory requests. So the goal of good eDiscovery strategy is to streamline the discovery process while minimizing the business disruption and reducing the risk while making it easier to pinpoint just the information you need and not an iota more. To work well, this process should be proactive, it should be defensible, and it should be collaborative. Without each of these parts, the whole might not succeed, and the entire process will end up costing considerably more than it ought. So the biggest step here, but likely the most worthwhile, is being proactive. With all the pieces in place, eDiscovery can become like any other business process. The more litigious or regulated a company is, the more important it becomes to establish and document overall policy, especially rules for retention and defensible deletion. Another critical step is to build a team where the key stakeholders can collaborate on strategies for preservation, for litigation hold, for collection. And then to avoid last-minute scrambles, you should have data maps and system inventories that are kept updated. The right resources, software, and vendors should all be identified and functional ahead of time. So the main expense of eDiscovery is the review of documents. These costs are directly related to the volume of data produced by your corporate systems and handed over to inside or outside counsel. Ideally, the processes and policies should be in place that limits your organizational data to that which is relevant to your business needs or which is required by regulation. Good information governance policies do this for you. Information governance by itself is a huge topic, and we have actually done webinars just on that in itself. But there are several areas that you should always target with an eye on avoiding the pitfalls we're talking about today in eDiscovery, specifically data maps and retention policy. Now, you would think that keeping up-to-date data maps would be a key consideration for any IT departments, but experience tells us this is not often the case. Good data maps need to be created and kept updated, and they should identify some things like where the data is located, what is covered by your systems like Microsoft 365, and what is not. Who owns this data? Where is it stored? What's challenging to access? Is it backed up? What tools can be used to access not just the data at hand, but also your backups or other copies of the data? The other key element of information governance, specifically for the eDiscovery, is having defined retention policies and processes to enforce them. These policies should be clarified. These policies should clarify the time limits for keeping various types of data. Without this policy in place, you have very little support for defensible deletion. In fact, it can be argued that all data should be stored, including items that might be redundant or outdated or trivial, without policies in place. So aside from the fact that this clutter impacts your business needs, this data is also costly to store, costly to search, and worse, your company's liable for every bit of it. So remember, absent a retention policy, the company has a legal duty to produce anything that might be relevant in litigations or regulatory requests. Just think for a moment how much of this rot lives in your legacy systems, your backups, your archives, be they in Microsoft 365 or elsewhere. It gets kind of scary, doesn't it, knowing what's out there or what could be out there. Now, aside from information governance, there are plenty of places to be proactive. You should know how to, you should know how you will handle your eDiscovery requests before it even is a glimmer on the horizon. To help with this, create an eDiscovery team and implement an eDiscovery process. The formation of an efficient team is essential for any eDiscovery process to work effectively. Members should be empowered to create and implement policy. To that end, the team should be pulled from legal, IT, and business units with other departments like compliance, HR, or records management supporting the overall efforts and also being consulted whenever necessary. In addition to proactively planning for eDiscovery, this team is ideally suited to put together processes for dealing with GDPR, CCPA, open records requests, and the like. Now, this team should also pull from their expertise to identify triggers for discovery and the personnel who are needed to be involved in any pending matter. They should also identify tools that can be used to accomplish a defensible collection and point out any challenges that may prevent an efficient collection from taking place. Having policy in place will limit the amount of data that needs to be collected, which directly impacts the cost of reviewing and processing. Being able to do so, to easily deploy these tools and identify the people or data sources of interest will make efficient use of resources rather than wasting time in a scramble under a deadline. Identifying problem areas in advance gives your attorneys a good background for legally required discussions with opposing counsel. And having this tested, repeatable process in place will significantly improve turnaround time and reduce mistakes. Microsoft 365 has great built-in tools, even for lower licensing levels. But you want to make sure that they're enabled and usable before you're under a tight deadline. Even if your organization has not taken these steps to be proactive, it should be able to mitigate risk by making sure that your eDiscovery requests are handled in a defensible manner. Many requests suffer because no attention was paid to the defensibility of the request from the start. Defensibility is the ability to justify your entire eDiscovery process and to defend it under scrutiny. Think a deposition or if you have to testify in a court case. Mistakes in this area are especially damaging when dealing with requests from security or legal teams. Therefore, effective defensible policy needs to have some very specific targets. Data should be preserved in as close to native format as possible. The entire process should be adequately the entire process should be adequately audited, and you should ensure that the repeating of the steps of your process will have consistent results, that it's repeatable. Now, preservation is making sure that the data is relevant to matter at hand, is not altered or destroyed. Altering data, even unintentionally, is known as spoliation. It carries severe judicial penalties and can call your entire eDiscovery process into question. Equally hazardous is the fact that you cannot search or collect data that is not there. Deletion and wiping activities are often scrutinized by the court in an adverse manner, which in turn could negatively impact your case. As discussed earlier, a good retention policy will outline how automated and manual deletion will be disabled in the event of litigation. The policy and applications that support it should be flexible enough to issue legal holds as needed, as well as suspend routine deletions based on custodians, data store, date range, and all the above. Verifying and assessing all of these steps is central to defensibility. Preservation is aided by litigation hold, which is the process of preserving data. With Microsoft 365, E3 and above licensing includes in-place legal holds, but you will need to define how your organization will implement those holds well in advance. Notification is also important. When litigation is imminent, you must identify the people of interest likely to be involved in the matter. These people, called custodians, should be informed about their duty to preserve and be made available to answer questions about the matter under litigation. Defensibility is also aided by auditing, which is keeping track of the discovery process when you're responding to a request. Keep in mind that any members of the discovery team may be called upon to give a deposition or testify as to how the data was collected, what types of policies are in place, etc. All discovery steps, from policy to production, should be consistently tracked. This is especially true of the searching and collection steps. The chain of custody detailing the search criteria, the original data stores, hash values, and the like should be scrupulously maintained. Microsoft 365 does have features to help you with this auditing, but you must know how it is presented for your licensing level and the types of data you're searching. So defensibility in all its forms is greatly aided when an organization collaborates effectively. Collaboration doesn't just mean the eDiscovery team. Even without a team, legal, IT, and business should be talking to one another. This communication between departments, especially IT and legal, is critical to keep the collection running smoothly. To assist in this effort, an eDiscovery liaison should be identified from the legal team who will work with IT and business to guide the process, establish the parameters, and navigate challenges. The liaison should be able to answer questions like questions from legal side of things. They should be able to safeguard the defensibility, and they should be able to inform the meet and confer sessions. They will also be the point person to ensure that the collections address legal requirements while understanding the technical challenges and define the scope of the project. Defining the scope of the project is essential once an eDiscovery request becomes a reality. Working closely to outline the details of the case requires input from all the stakeholders. From the outset, the scope needs to be articulated, especially to IT, because they need to understand and identify which key custodians need to be prioritized, what are the pertinent data storage locations, and identify which ones will be problematic. They need to know the methodology to deploy and the strategy for finding the data that is needed. They also need to know the parameters of the search, including dates, keywords, file types. And last but not least, they need to clarify what delivery formats are needed for both structured and unstructured data. Now, as you can imagine, this step is made so much easier if your organization has been proactive in setting out data maps and creating an eDiscovery team. So when we're talking about this process, identifying the challenges can be difficult, but if the process works correctly, they should be recognized ahead of time. Difficulties like what is reasonably accessible? What areas are challenging? What areas should we inform opposing counsel that we're not able to access? How are we going to address things like encrypted files or corrupt data stores? What kind of compliance is in place? What kind of monitoring is in place for each step of our process? Once you have these steps in place, once you have these proactive, defensible, and collaborative foundations in place, eDiscovery becomes much more effective, and the pitfalls are then limited.
At least in theory, right, Martin?
Exactly. I
Right.
mean, we can talk about the foundations. We can talk about how it works beautifully when you're sitting here in sort of an academic point of view. But the
Right.
reality is somewhat different, isn't it?
It gets a little bit messier as you start into the real world. So, one of the things that occurred to me as you were kind of going through your foundation discussion there was if you try to now draw some parallels between how we enforce these foundational principles and what we get out of the box with Microsoft 365, it's not always a one-to-one kind of a mapping, right? So I know that there are different variances, shall we say, in their product line that offer different feature sets depending upon the license level, perhaps, that somebody subscribed at. Can you maybe fill a
Right.
little
Sure,
context in
sure.
there?
Yeah. And let's remember Microsoft 365 encompasses an entire ecosystem of offerings. I think we should really focus our discussion on the data source most often required in eDiscovery searches. Also, Rick, as you well know, Microsoft can and does change licensing, features, usability options, and even the name of their offerings relatively frequently. I mean, that's why today we're referring to Microsoft 365 in this webinar and not Office 365. So
Right. I
keep
only
that in
get one of
mind.
those emails about every 2 days about new changes to our Microsoft 365 subscription.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
it's always, yeah, when you're logging in and something's changed, like where did that go or what's
Hmm.
there? Yeah, it gets complicated, and because of course they're SaaS offerings, they have that control. You can't, many organizations can't control what is being updated for them. But in any case, let's keep that in mind with the back of their head. It might change. So the details we're discussing today are subject to change based on the ever changing ecosystem for Microsoft. With that said, right now there are 3 eDiscovery offerings that Microsoft 365 has: content searching, core eDiscovery, and advanced eDiscovery, each which sort of builds upon the other one. They all have different target audiences and are available at different licensing or add-on levels. So content searching is the basic eDiscovery option. It's available in the Security and Compliance Center. And basically, designated users can choose content locations, configure criteria to run searches. The results can be exported and downloaded in native format, and it's available at most licensing level. This is typically what you're going to see when you look at the interfaces online. Added to that is core eDiscovery. This adds preservation to the content search by allowing administrators to place and manage basic legal holds. All admins using the system, as well as users who are subject to holds, must have at least E3 licensing or valid add-on features. Now, the kitchen sink, if you will, of eDiscovery offerings in Microsoft 365 is advanced eDiscovery. And again, remember, these names can change at the drop of a hat.
Hmm.
In any case, this is the highest level offering, and it's pretty impressive. I mean, it lets you keep your data, basically your data in place for the entire litigation process. I mean, it provides an end-to-end workflow. It includes analysis and review, custody management, case communication, amongst many other features, not just for discovery, but also for compliance. It's really quite impressive. I mean, it even has the options for connectors into other data stores, the ability to OCR, it's a robust feature set, but it does require the rather pricey E5 license tier, which can be a bit cost prohibitive for
Right.
many
For,
customers.
for sure, Martin. You can kind of infer from that flow chart that's on the screen that it's not necessarily easy to implement. There's a little bit of complexity that underlies all of that functionality, certainly.
Yeah, and you definitely, I mean, if you're going to be deploying advanced eDiscovery, you're going to need people who are experts in what they do, because not
Mhm.
just, you can't just have your average IT person go in and be doing this. They're going to need to have some training. And in fact, a lot of this is set up for different types of collaboration with legal teams and things like that. So it is a very, very complex tool, but very powerful. It's very powerful, and certainly there's implementations that might be interesting to many end users.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things maybe to keep in mind for those of you who are on the call who may be somewhat new to Microsoft 365 is these licensing levels, Mort has outlined, are not um, universal across your organization, right? So we often run into situations where a certain percentage of the workforce is licensed under E3, and then maybe a much smaller percentage. Think your executive team that's highly targeted for litigation might be licensed under E5 to give those additional capabilities. So you may want to check in with your IT folks to find out what license levels apply in your organization and which resources have which license level assigned to them.
Right.
So, Laura, I know, we've talked about the fact that there are some pretty capable built-in tools in the Microsoft 365 suite, but there are still some potential pitfalls that we should probably watch out for, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So when we're looking at Microsoft 365 tools, the benefits of the built-in capabilities are unmistakable. If you have the right kind of licensing, especially, these tools are already included, right? They're included in your search, your suite. You have the search. They're robust, they're fast, and there are many, many options out there for resources, for training, for all kinds of things that you can use that Microsoft supplies to help you out here. However, you need to understand that there are some challenges with these core features. And the first one is the reach of Microsoft 365. So, the end goal, I think, for Microsoft, especially with Office 365, is to unify all their data stores and all their processes under one cloud-based umbrella. But the reality of the matter is that most organizations have mixed solutions, right? They either have not or may never migrate fully to the cloud, and maybe it's not in their best use case to have a single source provider. Therefore, when you're looking at Microsoft 365, the biggest thing to keep in mind is, what is its reach? What are you actually using it for? Because that's where it's inherently limited. It can only cover the data stores under its purview. And if you ignore those other content areas, that can be very damaging to any kind of e-discovery that you're doing. And the number one place where you see Microsoft 365 is missing is user desktops and laptops. This is especially true, these days with lots of people working from home. And as long as policy allows it, and in some cases, despite policy saying you shouldn't do this, there will always be a wealth of data stored on those workstations and other local repositories. And the other thing is, you need to consider how to tackle non-Microsoft data stores. Many organizations keep information in places like Box, G drives, or even if you're looking at Mac-based data, this data cannot be touched by any sort of content sourcing within Microsoft 365, at least at the writing of this webinar. And let's not forget that organizations resist throwing things away. Many have some type of on-prem storage solutions like file shares, as well as other legacy corporate systems that can hold terabytes of potentially dangerous and responsive ESI. Data I'm thinking about includes things like backups or those venerable PST files that everyone has. And those also may be missing from Microsoft 365's reach. And there are other areas of pitfalls too. It's not just the content reach. The first thing is, to be aware of these limitations. So the first place that I think of is, the restrictions that we're looking at, the restrictions we're talking about often depend on your specific licensing and the add-ons that are deployed in your organization. As one might expect, the E3 discovery and compliance features are significantly curtailed compared to those found on the E5 level. For example, detailed analysis, data review, litigation hold notifications are supported in the one, but not in the other. And you may not be able to apply the complex expressions or reporting that you need in your specific use case at those lower levels of licensing. For example, the E3 licensing limitations, reporting keywords to 20 terms or phrases, it doesn't support regular expressions, and it can be challenging to do something like pinpointing specific fields or specific folders that you might be trying to scan. Now, to help resolve these issues, you first need to identify your typical use cases and identify where those weaknesses in your licensing level, does it have it or does it not, does it meet your needs? But you can resolve this by, number one, doing strategic licensing upgrades like you were talking about earlier, Rick. You basically have your key custodians, like your executives, on E5 licenses, whereas everyone else has the E3s. Or you could use less costly but complementary tools. That's another way that people will get around these kinds of issues. Now, the other thing that you want to be aware of is what the standard index, which is the backbone for all E3 and lower content searches, what does it contain? What data stores does it cover? What types of files does it support? And what is excluded? Now, Microsoft 365 does offer options to deal with the unindexed items, but it's up to you to determine how much of this will impact your specific process. Having a large set of unindexed items that might contain responsive data, you might need to address that in different ways. So you need to verify the searches in Microsoft 365 can target all your data stores, as well as find the special criteria like characters or acronyms that it might not contain in its index, but might be part of your standard litigation profile. So these pitfalls, they can be avoided by educating yourself, number one, on the limitations of the index, and then applying adaptive methodology where needed. Another issue, another challenge area, if you will, for the searches is customization or lack thereof. It really limits how much you can leverage Microsoft 365 features. Although, these options, as we mentioned before, every new release, they are growing. You have more and more options. They can be difficult, if not impossible, to adapt to your specific needs. If the features you're seeking, like maybe post-search filtering or folder searches, if they're not available outside of the box, you might need to modify your searches or, again, look for supplemental tools to help you out here. Now, one thing that I also want to mention is that the defensibility, I mentioned this before, it's one of the main considerations in an eDiscovery collection. Documentation is so important because missing details, incomplete inventories, or even lost log files can weaken the data and the searches that you're doing. So if your process is audited, if you're called in to testify, or even if you need to simply justify your results to a requester, you have to make sure the steps you've taken both inside and outside of Microsoft 365 are clear, that they're consistent, and that they're repeatable. And that last one is really important. A strong process will have supporting collateral to help you track and defend your process regardless of the tools you're using, whether it's Microsoft 365 or elsewhere. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this. You need to make sure it's not just Microsoft's own auditing tools you're using. You need to make sure you're auditing your entire process. So Rick, as we've seen, the Microsoft 365 clients may need to look to supplementing their features with other tools. And, I know we have some ideas about this as well. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure, Marta. Happy to. So, as capable as 365 is, and I think you've done a really great job of teasing out some of the excellent work Microsoft's done in their suite. Marta and I have both encountered circumstances where it just came up short. And that's often driven by specific use case needs. We'll talk a little bit about those in just a minute, but sometimes you just need to be able to supplement those inherent features that are built into the tool with a specialized piece of software. And we can maybe help you understand what some of the situations are. I know we've touched on some of this before in the presentation already, but it's important to maybe dive a little bit deeper into some of these areas. So what we're seeing in the marketplace today, since we launched our first discovery tool back in 2006, investigation at that time was, as Marta pointed out earlier, primarily based around email. But that's certainly not the norm now. I work with clients all the time that have to include network shares at the very least into that environment. Many of our 365 customers have taken the approach of exporting information from their mailbox environment to PST when an employee leaves the organization. So it's become sort of, if you will, the poor man's archiving capability to be able to hang on to that email content once somebody leaves the organization, and you want to free that Office 365 license up. So that introduces the need to be able to search that PST content. Marta pointed out the fact that local hard drives are increasingly in demand for eDiscovery search projects, and that is largely being driven by the fact that many of us were forced into this remote working situation over the last 12 months. And to be honest with you, we think this is going to actually be a growth area in eDiscovery in the next several years, because now we've got a year's worth of content that many people have stored locally on their machines as they were in a remote worker environment that might be subject to future eDiscovery requests that are going to be coming down the pike.
Yeah, and some organizations, let's not they're not going back to the office, especially, when it's particularly impacted by this. A lot of people like working from home and they see it works, and that's just going to be kind of an avenue in the future, for sure.
And one of the wrinkles we see around that particular avenue, Marta, is the fact that this comes up frequently, by the way, the fact that the remote workers often aren't connected to the corporate VPN when they're doing their work. They might be using web accessible systems, Salesforce and the like, that they're using for their workday environment, Teams, Zoom, whatever the case may be. None of those are going to require them to be on a corporate VPN. That poses a problem potentially if you, as a searcher, have to perform an eDiscovery search against that device. you've got to have some way to reach the information that's on that local hard drive, even when your users aren't necessarily connected to the VPN.
Right. And even if you're looking outside the VPN, you're looking at SharePoint or OneDrive or one of the options which are, outside the VPN by their very nature, you see a lot of people don't they don't use them. They'll do their work locally, and then when they have a finished product, they might update it there. Or some of them just aren't educated enough to have a consistent or trained enough, if you want to put it that way, that even if you have SharePoint as your policy or your standard in your organization or OneDrive, they're not using it, right?
Right.
I see that a lot as well. It becomes scattered, and a lot of times the policy isn't strong enough to prevent people from saving things to their hard drive. So that, of course, opens this whole avenue of, oh no, that's all now we're liable for it still because they're corporate machines, but it's
Yeah.
not under policy. And I think it's going to take a few years before that shakes out and people can actually get the discipline to do that. And also the time lags. I mean, I myself have issues. It's my work process. I'll be perfectly honest. I mean, I'll do my work locally and then update it so I don't have to deal with the lags and saving to SharePoint. Sometimes if the internet connection, it snows and it seems like the internet connection gets slower. I don't know, but yeah.
One of the things I did when I was prepping for the webinar today was put my OneDrive syncing on pause because I didn't want to encounter that specific situation. I feel your pain there. So, as much as Microsoft would like you to believe that they've got the total solution, you would certainly use their email and you'd store information in SharePoint, and your Teams environment is going to connect through OneDrive or Teams. There are still a lot of clients who are standardized on some other third-party storage, like Box or Dropbox or Google Drive. So there are still areas in your environment where you need to be able to search outside of that Microsoft sphere of influence. Let's move on to avoiding sanctions. So Marta touched on this earlier when she was going through her foundational description of a good sound foundation for your program and defensibility. How we can underscore how critical it is to be able to notify your custodians that they've been placed on litigation hold, advise them that they've got a responsibility to be able to preserve that content, a duty, in fact, to be able to preserve that content. That might include things like providing them with a copy of the standards document for your organization that details those responsibilities when an employee is placed on hold. It might include providing them with a questionnaire that asks them additional information relevant to whatever that litigation happens to be. Did you have meetings with these parties between these dates? Do you have paper records or external media like thumb drives or DVD drives that might contain relevant documents and so forth? All of that scope is covered under this custodian notification and tracking. You'd be amazed at the number of people that we interface with who are doing this through a combination of Excel spreadsheets and Microsoft Outlook. And while that might perform sort of a baseline functionality for them, it's not by any stretch of the imagination defensible. And if they do get called into account, in court by a judge with regards to spoliation, they may have a difficult time proving that that custodian was in fact properly notified and acknowledged and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
and consistency. Yeah, I think the point is, repeatability, consistency, how consistent can be from one case to another. And I'll point out that some of this is enabled, you have the in-place legal holds in even in the E3 license in Microsoft 365, but not all licensing levels includes this kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we run into a lot of confusion between the two terms, preservation hold and hold notification. So sometimes people associate that as one big sort of process that includes both pieces of that functionality, which isn't always the case. So I know from a hold notification point of view, you have to be fairly high up the food chain in terms of Microsoft licensing to have that capability. That's not as easily attainable as preservation hold for the Microsoft environment, I believe. And then finally, this idea of collaboration. We are increasingly seeing that the workload's being spread across different departments inside our clients. Often it's the IT folks who are charged with providing access to the information because they have the keys to the repositories. They can set up the service accounts, they can run the PowerShell commands to grant access, and so forth. But those guys don't often understand, and girls don't often understand the nuances of the search syntax or maybe chain of custody. So they're not the best suited to performing the whole eDiscovery process, even though sometimes it sort of gets dumped on their lap because they have access. Often that means someone with a legal background should be involved in the process, and the ability to extend your first pass review or possibly examine responsive content to outside partners at litigation service firms or maybe a full service law firm is becoming increasingly essential. And being able to give somebody like that access to your information, or only the pieces of your information that they should be able to see on a fairly simple basis, is growing in popularity. Now, again, this is one of those areas where I know Microsoft has some capability to provide access, but often that means giving someone outside your firm access to your whole Microsoft 365 environment, which may not be the ideal situation. What you may want to do is give them access to, for example, search results for a particular matter, so that that's the only thing that they're able to see. Maybe participate in the review of those search results, help you do the initial calling, build your responsive data set, and so forth. So this is another area where we see a growing trend of being able to improve the collaboration between the tools. So those are just some areas that we thought might be important for you to think about as you investigate the Microsoft 365 suite and what it may or may not be able to do in the confines of your eDiscovery process. Here at Sherpa, we believe that one size does not fit all also. So we do have a selection of tools to allow you to pick the technology that's best suited to your specific eDiscovery needs. I'll talk a little bit about Altitude. I'll give Marta the opportunity to talk about Discovery Attender because she's been closely involved with that product for a number of years. Altitude is our partial SaaS-based offering, so it does live partially in the cloud, but it also connects to your content being your mailboxes or maybe your network shares, your local workstations that we talked about earlier, SharePoint, OneDrive, a number of those repositories that we've discussed during the course of the conversation. It connects to them directly through agent software that you deploy internally. And those agents allow you to search an employee workstation or search a Google Drive environment or search a Box storage platform as part of the scope of your eDiscovery request. We also allow you to simply and easily allow a third party to have access to those search results based on a combination of their role and the matters that they're permitted to see so that they can come in and assist you with the evaluation. And then finally, it includes an integrated custodian tracking tool. So you do have that ability to advise your custodians they're on hold, remind them that that hold's ongoing, solicit additional information from them, and so forth. Marta, would you like to dive into Discovery Tender for just a minute?
Sure. So if you think of Altitude as an enterprise-wide solution, you think of Discovery Tender as it takes a more targeted approach. It's a small footprint application, and it's known for its ease of use, its targeted searching, and its strong reporting features, not just in our Windows world with PSTs and Exchange and the rest of it. It also works with Notes and Box and some other data stores as well. And we actually have two different versions of it, one for Lotus Notes and one for Windows. And there, just to be clear, there are many customers who use both Altitude and Discovery Tender jointly with Microsoft 365. In the case of Discovery Tender, they may use Microsoft 365 to perform the initial calls in the cloud, and then use, to take advantage of the speed and what have you, and then use Discovery Tender to apply more complex criteria or custom filters, auditing of records, that kind of thing. So we see collaboration not just between entities within an organization, but also between the tools that are being used as well. So one does not mean that you're not going to be using the other. Most people will use some combination of both, to address the weaknesses of each.
Yeah, absolutely. And we probably should be remiss if we didn't mention this, although we understand that it's not a huge market anymore, but we also have another flavor of our Discovery Tender technology that addresses the HCL Notes, formerly Lotus Notes product line. So there are some of you still out there grappling with NSF files, and Sherpa can help you with that situation as well. So that brings us to the end of our prepared comments today. Marta, thank you so much for helping me with the presentation and contributing your expertise. We'll take a look at the questions panel and see if you have any questions you'd like us to try and field before we end the webinar.
Thanks, Rick.